another one of my Alex Rider books. This one is book 6, and this one is called Archangel. Chapter 10. Injury Time. By Saturday, the race seemed to have been forgotten. Nicole Driver was in a good mood as he waited for another of his Rolls Royce. This one, a silver phantom, to be brought round to the front door. It was an important day for him. Stratford East. The team he had bought for £20 million were playing Chelsea in the Premiership, beaten 3-0 by Newcastle only the week before. Drevin was in high spirits. Have you always supported Chelsea? He asked Alex as they left the house. Yes, it was true. Alex lived only 20 minutes from Stamford Bridge, and he had often gone to games with his uncle. The club was almost bankrupt when it was bought by Roman Abramovich. Drevin looked thoughtful. I met him a few times in Moscow. We did not get on. I hope to disappoint both of you today. Alex said nothing. There was an intensity in Drevin's voice that suggested that as far as he was concerned, this was more than a game. The Rolls Royce pulled up and the two of them got in. Paul Drevin wasn't coming. He'd had a bad asthma attack the night before, and his doctor, who was based 24 hours a day at Neverglade, had said he needed a day's rest. And so Alex found himself alone with Drevin in the back of the car as they were driven down the motorway to London. You have no parents? Drevin said suddenly. No, they both died when I was very young. I'm sorry, an accident? A plane crash. It was easy for Alex to repeat the lie that MI6 had been telling him all his life. You had no relations? You have no relations? Nope, just Jack. She looks after me. That is very unusual. But then it seems to be that you are an unusual boy. It would be interesting, I think, to have a son like you. Joe looked out of the window. How are you getting on with Paul? He asked. Fine. He likes you? Drevin was still looking away, avoiding Alex's eye. I wish that he was a little more like you. He seems so aimless. Maybe he'd be happy if you let him go to an ordinary school. Alex said. That is not possible. Do you really think he's in any danger? He is my son. Drevin spoke the words with no emotion at all. He had summed Paul up. There was nothing else to say. He forced a thin smile to his lips. But enough of that, he went on. My team will beat you to your team. That is all that matters today. An hour later, they turned onto the Fulham Road, and they were forced to drive at a snail's pace through the thousands of people who were arriving for the game. The Chelsea fans in blue, the Stratford East supporters in red and black. Alex was glad that Drevin's Rolls Royce had tinted windows. Nobody could look in. He had come to Stamford Bridge 100 times on foot, and he'd always loved the sense of belonging. That moment when he became part of the crowd battling its way through rain or snow in the hope of seeing a home win. This was too comfortable, too isolated. He would have felt embarrassed if anyone had seen him. They turned into a complex of hotels, restaurants and health clubs that had come to be known as Chelsea Village. They swept away from the fans, following a narrow passage to the west stand. The car stopped in front of a revolving door with the words, Millennium Reception, in several above. They got out. Drevin had become more tense the closer they got to London. His eyes and mouth mouth were the 3 narrow slits, and he was twisting his ring in short, jerky movements. "Here is Miss Knight," he said, and Alex saw Tamara Knight, the over-efficient personal secretary he had met at the waterfront hotel. She was still dressed smartly in a jacket and shirt, even though she was at a football match. Alex noticed she was wearing black and red earrings. At least she hadn't forgotten her team colours. "Good afternoon, Mr. Drevin. Alex?" She nodded at both of them. "Lunch is being served on the 3rd floor. I have your passes." She gave them 2 security passes. "I have your passes." She gave them the 2 security passes marked "All access add T." "What does the T stand for?" Alex asked. "I presume it means you can go through the tunnel," Tamara explained. She sounded uninterested. "In fact, you can go anywhere you like, except onto the pitch." She turned to Drevin. "Good luck this afternoon," she said. "Thank you, Miss Knight." They went into what could have been the foyer of a very smart health club, with a dark wooden desk, a turnstile, a wide corridor with 2 oversized lifts. A uniformed security guard and a receptionist watched them as Tara called the lift. They travelled up to the 3rd floor in silence. Alex realised that he was entering hallowed ground. This was where the directors, chairman managers, and corporate sponsors came. Normally he wouldn't have been allowed anywhere near, yet still he felt ill at ease. Jared might have forgotten the kart race, but he hadn't. It seemed to Alex that the more he learnt about him, the less attractive he became. An absolute wonderful man. That was how Paulie had described him. Well, MI6 had said much the same about DeMay and Cray. Alex knew that Drevin was a bad loser, and he had dark feelings about this match, which he couldn't shake off. "How are you enjoying your stay with Mr. Drevin?" Tamara asked suddenly. "It's fine. I hope you're keeping out of trouble." Was she trying to tell him something? Alex examined the attractive blue eyes, but they were giving nothing away. The lift doors opened and they walked out into the corridor, lined with dark wooden panels, and into a dining room with a buffet table on one side. Waitresses were circulating with champagne. And if you're wondering what champagne is, it's like a sort of drink, but I'm certain you would know what champagne is. I'm not very certain I know what champagne is. I'm certain you will, because I think you're above 10 or 15. I'm below 5. I'm below 10. I'm only 8. I'm 8 years old. Soon I'm gonna be 9. I'm 8 years old. 4 days ago was my brother's birthday. He is 5 and I am 8. My mom's 43 and my dad's 42. Let's carry on. Unlike the rest of the complex, the room was old-fashioned, with a moulded ceiling and a series of ornate smoked glass windows. But for the 2 widescreen televisions mounted on the walls, it could have belonged to the 19th century. Drevin accepted a glass of champagne and sat down at one of the tables where about half a dozen people, including the Stratford East chairman and a couple of footballers' wives, were already seated. There were about 50 people in the room. Alex recognised a couple of television actors chatting to the Chelsea chairman, who, unlike Drevin, looked completely at ease. A waitress gave Alex a glass of lemonade and sipped it in silence. He found himself standing beside Tamara Knight. "Are you a football supporter?" he asked. "No," She looked bored. I never really understood the British obsession with football. Of course I want Mr. Drevin to win, but otherwise I don't really care. Alex found himself getting annoyed. Tamara looked like a model or an actress, but she seemed determined to act like a cold-blooded businesswoman. How did you work for Mr. Drevin? He asked. Oh, an agency recommended me. Do you enjoy it? Of course I do. Mr. Drevin is a very interesting man. She was unwilling to say any more and looked relieved when the door suddenly opened and a young woman came striding in. Alex took in the blonde hair, the permanent tan, the diamond collar necklace, and the perfect teeth. He recognized her instantly. Her face was rarely absent from the tabloids or the television screen. Her name was Cayenne James, and she had once been a model or an actress. Then she had married Adam Wright, one of the country's most famous strikers and a member of the England squad. Wright had made the headlines himself when Drevin had paid £24 million to buy him from Manchester United. He was now the captain of Stratford East. Alex wasn't surprised that his wife had turned up to see him play. He watched as she went over to Drevin and kissed the air close to his cheeks, then sat down and helped herself to champagne. The conversation in the room had quietened when she came in. Alex was able to hear their first exchange. How are you, Nicky? She had a loud, schoolgirlish voice. Sorry, I'm late. I just popped into Howard's. It's only down the road. Was your husband with you? No, don't worry, she giggled. Adam's been concentrating on a big match. He's never come up shopping when there's a game coming up. More food was served. Alex was feeling increasingly out of place. He was sorry Paul hadn't been able to come. It was past 2. He wished the game would begin. Half an hour later, it did. The smoked glass windows and doors were opened, and everyone walked out. Alex went with them, emerging onto a stand with about 100 seats, one higher up. Exactly opposite the tunnel, and at that exact moment, he was able to forget Drevin, Neverglad, go-karting and all the rest of it. The magic of the stadium moments before kick-off overwhelmed him. The Stamford Bridge has room for over 42,000 spectators, and today, in the bright afternoon sunlight, every seat was full. Music was pounding out on the speakers, fighting with the fans who were already chatting good-humouredly. Alex watched as the Mexican wave travelled in a huge circle in front of him. He had been given seat A10, perfectly placed between the two goals. There were no policemen in sight. Chelsea has its own army of stewards, but it didn't look as if anyone was in the mood for trouble. Then there was a roar as the teams emerged and formed two lines, each one accompanied by a small child. The referee and the two linesmen joined them. You're next to me, tomorrow night announced. Alex sat down. He was determined to enjoy the next hour and a half, but it was obvious, almost from kick-off, that it was going to be a hard, unfriendly game. After just 10 minutes, one of the Chelsea players was brought down by a vicious tackle that immediately earned Stratford East a yellow card. It was to be the first of many. Chelsea dominated the first half, and but for the hard work of the Stratford East keeper, they would have soon taken the lead. Then half an hour in, the right winger gathered the ball and sent it in the perfect cross to the penalty area. And a second later, it had been heading into the goal. The crowd roared, the speakers blared. It was 1-0 to the home side. And just 15 minutes later, the Chelsea captain beat 2 defenders and powered the ball into the back of the net. Stratford East went into the break 2 goals down. There were more drinks served in front in the dining room during the interval, but Alex was careful to avoid Nicoli Drevin. He remembered how he'd behaved at the end of the kart race. This was 1,000 times more humiliating. The game was being shown all over the country. Drevin had spent a sizable fortune building up his team, and the fact that he was being beaten by Chelsea, owned by another Russian, somehow made it all the worst. Kane James didn't help. "Never mind, Nicky," she said in her silly, high-pitched voice. "It's not over yet. I'm sure Adam will be taken to the boys in the dressing room. It would be nice if your husband were to touch the ball." Drevin replied. He had a glass of champagne, but was holding it as though it was poison. "He does seem a bit tired today. Maybe he's saving his strength for the second half." In fact, Adam White was barely visible when the game began again. Alex wondered why the manager didn't put him off. He was playing into the centre, but never seemed to be anywhere near the ball. And when he did take possession, he didn't create a single opportunity. Alex knew that the Stratford East captain had been given a bad ride by the press. He should never have left Manchester United. He spent more time modelling clothes and advertising aftershave than playing football. His last outings for England had been dismal. Half the country had turned against him, and perhaps it was now affecting his game. The next goal, when it came, was more of a fluke than anything else. With an untidy scrabble in front of the Chelsea goal, for a moment, the ball was invisible. Then Stratford East player got his foot to it. The ball deflected off another player's thigh and sailed past inches away from the Chelsea keeper's outstretched finger. It wasn't pretty, but it made the score 2-1 with 15 minutes left to play. After that, Chelsea rarely lost control over the ball. Alex found himself whittling them on, hoping they would keep their lead until the final whistle. He knew it was ungenerous of him. He was here as Drevin's guest, but Chelsea were the better team, and he'd been blue all his life. He kept his emotions to himself, though, resting the temptations. Resisting the temptations. He really kept his emotions to himself, though, resisting the temptation to join the home supporters, and they urged their team on. Full time, it seemed that Chelsea had it in the bag, but then, out of nowhere, 3 minutes into injury time, came the chance to equalise. A foul inside the Chelsea penalty area. One of Stratford East players went down, gripping his legs in agony. And although I suspected he was faking, the referee believed him. There was a blast of the whistle, another yellow card. A roar of disbelief from the crowd, but Stratford East had been awarded the penalty. It was to be the last shot of the game. Adam White stepped forward to take it. He couldn't miss. He had taken penalties for England countless times. I still watched him perform brilliantly against Portugal in the last European Championships, firing the ball into the net with breathtaking ease. Surely he would do the same now. A peculiar hush had descended on the stadium. After making so much noise, it was astonishing that over 42,000 people could be so quiet. I just glanced down at Drevin, sitting 4 seats away. The man's entire body was tense, but there was something close to a smile on his face. He knew there was no way Stratford East would win this game, but a draw would be enough. There was no humiliation in a draw. And the rifle settled the ball on the penalty spot. The Stratford East players were ranged behind him. The Chelsea keeper was crouching, rubbing his hands together. The moment seemed to stretch out to an eternity. The crowd held its collective breath. Adam Wright ran his hands through his hair. It was this season, with blonde highlights. The referee blew his whistle. A single short blast. Wright ran forward almost lazily and kicked. Alex watched in disbelief. And something had gone terribly wrong. The keeper had misdirected and had dived to the left, but the ball hadn't gone anywhere near the goal. A clump of grass and mud sailed in one direction, while the ball soared in the other, passing at least a yard over the crossbar. Adam Wright realised what had happened, and even at this distance, Alex thought he could see the shock in his eyes. Then slowly everything seemed to unfreeze. The keeper got to his feet, punching the air with both fists. The Stratford East players stood where they were, stunned. The Chelsea fans roared with pleasure. Their visited supporters sat in paralysed, silent, and Drevin? He had gone very pale. His hands were clasped together, his eyes empty. A few seats away from him, James giggled nervously. "Oh dear," she squealed. Drevin turned to look at her, and Alex could see that he made no attempt to disguise the content in his face. And then it was all over. The referee didn't even bother with another kick-off. He blew the final whistle and the two teams came together, shaking hands and swapping shirts. More music pounded out as the screen flashed up the final score. 2-1 to Chelsea. The stewards reappeared and the crowd started to trickle out of the stadium. Drevin was suddenly much alone. As Alex watched, he dug a hand into his trouser pocket and took out a mobile phone. He pressed the speed dial button and spoke briefly. Alex got the feeling that he was talking in Russian, but even if it had been English, he wouldn't have been able to hear above the general din. Drevin's face was colourless. Whatever he was saying, Alex doubted he was sending a team a congratulatory message. Drevin put his phone away and stood up. He seemed to notice Alex for the first time. "I'm sorry." Alex wondered. He didn't know what to say. There will be other games." Drevin's voice was heavy. "If you don't mind, Alex, I will ask Miss Knight to accompany you home. The driver was waiting outside. I have some business to attend to." Tamara nodded. "Whatever you say, Mr. Drevin." Drevin went back into the dining room. Alex took one last look at the stadium, at the great rectangle of green grass. The departing spectators. He knew it was unlikely he would ever have this view of Stamford Bridge again. Something caught his eye. The sun is glinting off something. Somebody in the crowd. No, it wasn't possible. Alex looked again, then he hurried down the steps to the edge of the terrace and looked more carefully. His eyes searched the mini crowd. He knew what he had seen. He just hoped he was mistaken. He wasn't. Silvertooth was standing on the edge of the pitch. Alex looked down, shocked. The man he'd knocked out with a defibrillator, and who had been there with Force 3 when he was interrogated, was there. In the crowd, he had been watching the game as if that was what he did on a Sunday afternoon when he wasn't kidnapping people. Alex watched as he slipped something into his jacket pocket and then began to move slowly towards the south stand. Tomorrow night called out to him, "Alex!" What should he do? Alex didn't want any more involvement with Force 3. He was meant to be on a holiday recuperating, but he couldn't just let the man walk away. He made his decision. He turned and ran past her. "I'll meet you at the car," he called out, and then he was gone, through the glass doors into the dining room, searching for the way back down. Chapter 11. Blue Murder. Force 3 were here at Stamford Bridge. As Alex burst out into the open air, he knew they hadn't come to watch a football match. They had already attacked Drevin once through his son. Was it possible they were going to try again? This time targeting his football team. Alex reached the edge of the pitch and looked around. crowd was slowly disappearing through the various exits, like sand trickling out of a leaking bucket. There still must have been at least 10,000 people in the stadium. Now that he was at ground level, he wondered if he would have any chance of spotting the man he knew only as Silvertooth again. Up on the giant television screen, Adam Wright was being interviewed about the missed penalty. The Stratford East captain had a boyish face. He could have been about 19. He looked inside as if he was sulking. So, I don't know what happened, he's saying. I thought the ball moved just before I kicked it. The soil was a bit soft around the penalty spot. I don't know, it's just one of those things. I suppose there's always a next time. Alex glanced away from the image, and that was when he saw him. Silvertooth was wearing an orange Gore-Tex jacket. Perhaps he thought it was going to rain. There was a large gap between the terraces and the pitch, and I saw Silvertooth as he separated from the crowd. He was walking purposely around the front of the south stand, not making for any of the exits. I was able to examine him properly for the first time. He was in his 20s, not English. His look was Middle Eastern. His hair was long and dirty. It wasn't just his teeth that needed attention. Alex followed him behind the goal and towards the players' tunnel. What was the man doing here? He turned the question over and over in his mind. Silvertooth reached the tunnel and disappeared from sight. Alex quickened his pace, grateful for the security pass around his neck. A couple of Silver's glasses waved, and neither of them tried to stop him. It occurred to him that Silvertooth must have a pass too. If so, how had he got it? Or was his simply forged? He reached a tunnel which was surrounded by a sea of empty blue seats, with a press box just above. 9 steps led down to an old-fashioned metal and wire gate. In normal circumstances, Alex would have given anything to be here. He had watched his team emerge countless times from right where he was standing. He could hear pictures of He could picture the spectators in their thousands, hear the chatting and clapping swelling into the roar of excitement. Despite all his resolutions, I knew that he was getting into trouble once again. Trouble, it seemed, just wouldn't let him go. I entered a modern, surprisingly empty area with a ceiling so low it would be up presses and grey tiles on the floor. There was no sign of Silvertooth. There were a couple of gleaming silver bins and a bench where injured players could receive immediate FISO. The air was cold and sterile, endlessly recycled by a powerful air conditioning system. Everything smelled brand new, and Alex recalled that the owner of Chelsea had spent millions of pounds smarting the place up. He rushed open the door and found himself looking into the press room, a rectangular space with about 20 seats facing a narrow platform. The journalists had already left. There was an outer room with 2 walls covered in carefully placed advertisements. But he recognised the spot where Adam Wright had been interviewed only a few minutes ago before. He tried another door. As he pushed it ajar, he heard voices coming from inside. One was all too familiar. He held the door open a crack and looked through. Yes, combat jacket was there. The last time Alex had seen him, he had been shooting at him with an FP9 single-action pistol, blocking his escape from a blazing building. Now he was standing with his back to the door, hands on hips. Silvertooth and spectacles were with him. They were surrounding a 4th man who was sitting on a bench, a towel wrapped around his waist. It was Adam Wright. This was the visiting team changing room. Peering through the narrow crack, Alex didn't dare open the door any wider. He took it into the blue padded benches, the lockers, the vending machine filled with water and Lucozade, the ultra-modern showers and toilets, On the far side the ceiling was low here too. Alex could almost feel the weight of the seating in the stand directly overhead. Stratford East captain was the only player in the room. The others must have left while he was being interviewed, getting out as fast as they could after losing the game. Adam Wright was looking up at the three men towering over him. He was clearly surprised to see them. "If you guys don't mind," he said, "I was just going to take a shower. We don't usually have visitors in the players' changing room." We represented the Stratford East Supporters Club, Combat Jacket said. "We have something for you. A thank you present." Spectacle added. "Thanks, right, to thank you for everything you've done for the team." Combat Jacket took a sealed plastic box from his pocket and held it out. Adam Wright took it. "Well, that's very kind of you guys, but if you don't mind, I'll open it later." "We'd prefer you to open it now." Hank was only a few meters away from the Stratford East captain, who was sitting facing him. He watched as the player opened the box and took out a gold medallion on a chain. It was an appropriate present. Adam Wright was wore more jewelry than most women's. Earrings, bracelets, and a different necklace every day of the week, but none of this made sense. The three men in the dressing room were killers. What were they offering gifts to a footballer who just blown up a game? "It's really nice," the Stratford East captain said, holding up the medallion. It was round and chunky, about 4 centimeters across, like an oversized coin. There was a figure engraved on the front. It was himself, heading a ball into a net. "It's great," he said. "Can you tell me the fans? Do you know I really appreciate this?" "Aren't you going to put it on?" Combat Decker asked. "Sure." Wright sipped over his head. A medallion rested on his muscular chest. "It's quite light. What is it made of?" "Calcium," Combat Decker said. Adam Wright looked blank. "Is that right?" he asked. "Oh, yes. Getting hold of it can be murder." Something nudged the back of Alex's neck. Alex stepped backwards, allowing the door of the changing room to close, and he heard no more of the conversation. There's something about the touch of a gun that is unmistakable. It's just the coldness of the metal. It's the whisper of death that comes with it. Very slowly, Alex turned around. He saw the gun clasped in 2 hands, one of them swathed in bandages. He knew that the man who had held it broken at least a couple of fingers. Alex remembered him from the magnetic resonance and imaging chambers at St. Dominic's. He was very short and very well built. Alex had nicknamed him Steel Watch, but the watch was no longer there. It must have been broken when the man crashed the MRI machine. Alex was a little surprised that the same thing hadn't happened to his neck. "You," Steel Watch was shocked to see Alex. Alex raised his hands. "Don't suppose you've got the time?" he asked. Steel Watch grimaced. He seemed unsure what to do. He had been about to enter the changing room. The other members of Force 3 were waiting for him, but he had personally scored to settle with Alex. He made up his mind. "You and I are going to leave quietly together," he ordered. "I'm going to walk behind you. The gun will never be more than a few inches away. You'll not speak, you'll not stop. If you try anything, I'll put a bullet in your spine. Do you understand?" "Where are we going?" "There's a van, I'll show you. Now move." I said no choice. You can see I still watched meant exactly what he said. He was going to force him out of the stadium and make him prisoner for a second time. He knew if he got in the van, he'd be dead anyway. Both Combat Jacket and the Steel Watch had just scored to settle with him. They were adults, professional killers. He was a child, but he had beaten them twice. They were going to enjoy making him pay. The Steel Watch gestured with his gun, and Alex walked down the corridor leading away from the tunnel. He noticed that the man was wearing a security pass just like his. It had to be fake. There was nobody around, but even one of the stewards disappeared. There would be nothing Alex could do if he called for help. Steel Watch would kill him and then run. There were still hundreds of people milling around Stamford Bridge. It would be simple to disappear into the crowd. Briefly, Alex thought about Adam Wright and wondered what was going on inside the changing room, but there was nothing he could do to the footballer. He was worried about himself. They left the building. The east was now behind him. The terrace slanting up and at an angle from the ground. There was a high wall straight ahead. Alex knew that the railway ran behind it. The wall had been built to keep out of the noise. On the other side of the tracks was a cemetery. Alex had been there when his uncle, Iron Rider, was buried. He had to think. If he didn't do something soon, he might well end up joining him. Steelwatch jabbed the gun into the small of his back, deliberately hurting him. He had seen a couple of policemen standing on the other side of the gates that led him to the Fulham Road. There was an endless queue of people filtering slowly out of the gates. The bars, restaurants, and hotels were open. Alex paused. He couldn't believe they were about to walk through the middle of it all. Steelwatch sensed his hesitation. "We're going to start walking now," he hissed. "Remember, the gun is out of sight. There'll be one shot and nobody will know where it came from. You'll be lying in the gutter and I'll be gone. Head out of the gate and across the road. I'll tell you where to go after that." Alex began to walk with the wall on his left. He turned the corner and saw the ticket booths and souvenir shop just ahead. Stratford's fans seemed to have taken their disappointment with them. But Chelsea supporters were in no hurry. It was a mild evening, and this was the place to be. Meeting friends, savouring the victory. Alex knew that the situation would get worse with every step he took. Right here, now there might be something he could do. There were two policemen chatting together on whether anything was wrong. There would be a dozen more on the Fulham Road. But once Alex moved away from the crowd, he would be totally exposed. Steelwatch had mentioned a van. Alex imagined the steel door slamming shut behind him, and at the moment he would be good as dead. He had to do something now, but they thought it was too late. He glanced over his shoulder. Steelwatch was being careful, keeping a safe distance between them. The man had his hands tucked under his jacket. It didn't even look as if the two of them were together. But Alex knew that the gun was trained on him. If he tried anything, Steelwatch would fire through the fabric. He couldn't speak. He could turn, he had to keep moving. He couldn't turn, he had to keep moving. The gates were getting closer. The Fulham Road was beyond. One of the policemen was giving somebody directions, but they weren't going to help him. What about the crowd? Ahead of him, next to the exit, he got a glimpse of red and black. Two Stratford East supporters in team shirts. One of them was skin-headed, with small red eyes and a ruddy, pock-marked face. He was scowling at the department. Chelsea fans, and Alex could see that he would love to cause trouble. He was swaying on his feet. He'd probably been drinking. But there were too many policemen around. All he had was attitude, and he was showing as much of it as he could. Alex was heading straight towards him, with Steelwatch close behind. And suddenly, he had a thought. Steelwatch was keeping an eye on his every movement, but he couldn't see his face. He couldn't see what he could do with his hands. But the Stratford East supporter could. Alex slowed down. Keep moving. Steelwatch ordered in a low, ugly voice. Alex stared at the skinhead. He had once read somewhere that if you stared at a person hard enough, they'd become aware of you. He had tried it often enough because when he was bored in class. Now he focused all his attention on the man, even as he continued walking forward. Weaving through the crowd, the man looked up. It was in telepathy. There was no real way he could avoid him. Alex was about 50 metres away, getting closer all the time. People were crossing in front of him. Fathers with their sons, couples, fans dressed in the blue Chelsea strip. But Alex ignored them. His eyes drilled into the Stratford East supporter. Skin had noticed him. His own eyes nagged. Alex's hand was against his chest, with his gaze still fixed on the man. He raised two fingers slowly and deliberately. He dropped one of them. Unseen by Steelwatch, he had signalled the score 2-1, and he had left his middle finger standing offensively upright. Alex needed a supporter, trying to look as aggressive as he could. The supporter said, Alex repeated his sign. This was the worst insult he could throw at the man without opening his right. Alex had been right. The Stratford East supporter was drunk. He watched his team lose with almost as much disgust as Trevor himself. When the botched penalty in the final seconds had enraged him, and here was some crocky little sod. A Chelsea supporter making fun of him. Well, to hell with the police, to hell with the crowd. He was going to stand here and take it. He was going to sort him out. He lumbered forward, and I felt a spurt of excitement, and he saw that his calculator worked. But I'm still hadn't realised what was going on. Things had happened very quickly. I just needed the element of surprise. The Stratford supporter stopped in front of him, blocking his path. What's your problem? He demanded. Alex and behold, he had no choice, and he felt Steelwatch bump into him. There was no longer any distance between them. I said, what's your problem? Alex said nothing. He had been instructed not to talk. Instead, he twisted the face into a sneer of his amusement, mocking the man he stood in front of him. It worked. The supporter spotted him and lashed out with his right fist. I stuck the fist through past his head as it slammed in the throat of Steel Watch. He had been standing right behind him. The gun went off. The bullet hit the Stratfordy supporter in the arm, spinning him around. Panic erupted. Suddenly everyone was screaming and running away as somebody had been shot, but not knowing who had fired. Two policemen charging through the gates. Behind them, a third policeman appeared on horseback. The horse whined and began to push through the scattering crowd. The Stratford East supporter was sitting on the ground, clasping his injured arm. I felt sorry for him, but he wasn't going to hang around. The instant gun had been fired. He had darted away, driving into the crowd, moving left and right, hoping Steel Watch wouldn't have a chance to shoot again. He timed it perfectly. Steel Watch didn't dare to try another shot. There were already too many people between him and he couldn't bring out the gun without drawing attention to himself. There were police everywhere. There was nothing more he could do. I ran on past the Chelsea shop and on towards the entrance when the car had dropped him before the match. Tomorrow Night was standing there. She was looking alarmed, and I just wondered if she had heard the shot. Then he realised she was staring at him. She could tell from his face that something was wrong. "Alec, what is it?" she demanded. "Get help," he exclaimed. "Call the police, whatever." He shook his with. "You got to send someone into the changing room. Adam Wright, I think he's in trouble." What are you talking about?" Force 3. It was too complicated to explain. Your personal assistant was looking at him, and he was doing range. He was meant to begin. "Just trust me. You need to get security over to the changing rooms. Please, believe me." Tamara gazed at him for a few seconds, sounding out. He didn't look as if she believed him, but then she nodded. "All right, then. There's a steward inside." He turned and hurried back into the West End. It was already too late. The 3 men had left the changing room. Adam White was on his own. He fingered the new medallion they had given him. He had more than a dozen of them in gold and platinum. He always liked medallions, even when he was a boy growing up in Essex. He thought they suited him. It was strange, though, receiving a gift after a game like that. Adam White thought about the missed penalty as he went over to the showers. However, he looked at it. He wasn't having a good season. Maybe it was time to think about another transfer. He had to be careful. If his game began to slip, he might lose some of his advertising and sponsorship deals. And if it happened, how would he pay for his next Ferrari? He dropped his towel, glimpsing into himself in the mirror. He smiled. He had a perfect body, and he liked the way the new medallion laid against his chest. He was looking forward to showing it to Kane. He turned the shower on full. Her water blasted down. He stepped in the spray, and water battered his neck and shoulders. He turned around. The man who had given Anne White the medallion had told him that it was made of caesium. But I hadn't told him that the caesium is an alkane metal found in a group one of the periodic table. It doesn't occur naturally. It has only one electron in its outer shell, and like all alkane metals, which reacts extremely violently when it's exposed to water. The medallion had been given a coating of wax to protect itself. It protected from the atmosphere, but the wax was now melting in the shower. Adam White knew there was something wrong when he felt an intense burning. The moment he thought the water was too hot, then he looked down, and to his astonishment, he saw a brilliant flame bursting out in front of him. He opened his mouth to scream, and at the moment, the caesium medallion exploded. The scream died in his throat. With the water rushing down, he fell to his knees, his hands outstretched, and for a brief second, he looked just like a keeper. Seconds after, he had let the ball into the back of the net. Then he pitched forward and lay still. He said the door of the changing room crashed open, and a group of security men rushed in. There was nothing they could do. Adam White was lying on the floor, with water all around him. Smoke was riding up between his chest, whooping through his armpits. The Stratford captain and England striker had taken his last penalty, and able to come for him, hadn't missed. Chapter 12. Expiry date. The following day, Ice was playing table tennis with Paul Drevin. Once again, Paul was beating him. The score was 15-18, and it was his serve. He fired the ball down the table, trying to put some spin on it. Paul lobbed it back. Ice went for the slam and got it. The ball hit the corner of the table and bounced over Paul's bat. 16-18. He was in with a chance. The two boys were playing in the most extraordinary room Alice had ever been in. It was more than 60 meters long, but with only 60 meters wide. An oversized cigar tube with porthole windows running along the whole length. Part of the room was carpeted with luxurious leather chairs and arranged out a coffee table, a drinks cabinet, and a widescreen TV. Then there were the games area, complete with table tennis, snooker table, PlayStation and gym. Next to it was a small but well-equipped kitchen, and on the other side closed off a study area with a library and conference table where Nicole Drebin was now working, and the whole thing was 36,000 feet above the ground. Alice and Paul were on their way to America, flying in Drebin's private 747, which had adapted to his own needs. Forget cramped seating and microwave food on plastic trays. The interior of the plane was beyond belief. Like, imagine a really lovely plane. Imagine that plane 1 billion times more better than that. That's what it means. It's beyond belief. You cannot imagine. It's beyond belief. But for the noise of the engines and the occasional turbulence, it would have been hard for Alex to believe that he was in the air. He was glad to be out of England. The death of Adam Wright had naturally made the front page of every newspaper. It had also been the lead story in all the news programs on TV. This time Alex had not been involved, and for that he had to thank tomorrow night. She alone knew that he had seen and followed. He had seen and followed one of the killers at Stamford Bridge, and when the body in the showers had been discovered, she had decided to keep this information to herself, and she said to Alex he'd been through enough. All three had already claimed responsibility for the murder. Explained that the footballer had been another victim in their war against Drebin. What difference would it make if Alex was dragged into it once again? Tamara was on the right plane too, sitting in one of the leather chairs reading a book. I suddenly glanced at the cover and seeing the title. She was reading A History of Space Travel, obviously preparing herself for the launch that was to take place in just 3 days' time. She glanced up briefly as he prepared to take his next serve, then turned the page. Alex lost the serve, and 2 points later, the game. He wondered if they reached the coast of Canada yet. It had been for almost 5 hours since they had left Heathrow, and even with all the comforts of the 747, he was aware that he was in that strange, empty space, hovering on the edge of the world between 2 time zones. Are you hungry? Paul asked him. No thanks, Alex replied. The plane had a cook and two stewardesses who had served a bunch of fresh fruit, coffee and croissants just after they had taken off. We can watch a film if you like. All right. Paul put down his bat and slumped into one of the nearby chairs. It's a shame we won't have more time in New York, he said. I really wanted to show it to you. It's a cool city just to wander around in. And it's got great shops. I was going to buy a whole load of gear. How long are we there for? I asked. Dad says just 1 day. He's got some people to see, or we'd be going straight to Flamingo Bay. Paul pressed the button in the arm of his chair. A moment later, one of the stewardesses appeared. Can I watch a film? He asked. Of course. The stewardess smiled. I'll bring you the menu. And would you like something to drink? I'll have Coke. Alex? No, I'm fine. Alex sat down opposite Paul, avoiding the boy's eyes. It seemed to him that Paul was more like his father than perhaps he realised. Despite his protests, he fitted comfortably into this billionaire lifestyle, taking the private plane, the houses all over the world, and a complex freedom for being at school. For granted, right now the two of them should have been at school. Alex thought of Brookland, and a big part of him yearned to be with his friend, larking around and getting into trouble. Back in the real world, he was feeling guilty because, although he'd said nothing to Paul, he only made his decision. As soon as he arrived in New York, he was going to leave the Drebin household. He felt sorry for Paul. More and more, the other boys seemed to be relying on his friendship taken him for granted like everything else. Paul hadn't chosen any of this, but he was stuck with it. And one day, it would be him jetting around the world, making all the important decisions. But Alex had had enough. Nicole Drebin had nothing he wanted. More than that, Alex was becoming increasingly uneasy, where an invisible net closing in. He had now encountered Force 3 twice. He might not be so lucky at third time. Whatever their argument with Drebin, he didn't want to be any part of it. And then there was a question of Drebin himself. There was so much about the man that didn't add up. He was so concerned about Paul's safety. Why hadn't he put any guards in place at St. Dominic's? And was it just coincidence that the kidnappers had taken Alex to a building that Drebin, or one of the Drevin's companies, actually owned? He thought about his meeting with Caspar. The Force 3 leader had been about to cut off one of his fingers, and would have if I hadn't convinced him who he really was. If Paul Drebin had been kidnapped, he would have been named. Why? Was there some sort of private vendetta between Nico Drebin and Caspar? The both men were keeping concealed. I didn't trust Drebin. That was the simple truth. When they had raced against each other, Drebin had tried to kill him. If Alex had flipped over inside the tunnel, he might have been crushed, and all because the Russian didn't like losing. He had lost again at Chelsea, and as a result, a man had died. Was Drebin responsible for that too? I just remembered seeing him talking on his mobile seconds after the game ended, and when Alex had spotted Silvertooth, he had been slipping something into his pocket. Could it have been a phone? Was it possible that he had been talking his orders directly from Drebin? Well, he had decided. As soon as he arrived in New York, he was going to call Jack Subway. He was only a couple of hours away in Washington. He knew she'd be happy for him to join her, especially if she thought he was in any danger. He would tell Nicole Drebin that he was homesick. It didn't matter what excuse he made up. When Drebin and his son flew to Flamingo Bay, they would be travelling without him. Is everything all right, Alex? I looked up and realized that tomorrow night I'd been examining him. She still hadn't worked out. She'd never been particularly friendly to him and him completely devoted to Nicole Drebin. On the other hand, as far as he knew, she had never told Drebin and his involvement in Adam Wright's death. Right now she was studying him suspiciously. Maybe she was trying to work him out too. I'm fine, thanks, I said. Are you looking forward to the launch? Alex shrugged. I suppose so. Paul had chosen a film. The lights in the centre by the camera dimmed, and a few minutes later it began. It was just after 1 o'clock New York time when they touched down at JFK Airport. Nicole Drebin had come out of his study for the last hour of the flight, dictating a letter to Mara and chatting to Paul. Part of the conversation was in Russian. I just got the feeling that the father and son were talking about him. The 7F7 taxied to a holding area. Looking out of a window, Alex saw a chauffeur-driven limousine waiting to meet them. He guessed that a man as rich, as influential as Drebin wouldn't have to queue up at immigration with everyone else. With everyone else. And he was right. The door of the plane opened electronically, and 2 men in suits, costumes, and immigration were shown in. One of them had a metal attacher case, which contained a computer and an old-fashioned passport stamp. Good afternoon, Mr. Drebin, sir, the man said. He was young, clean-shaven, with short blonde hair and dark glasses. Welcome to New York. Thank you. Drebin held out his passport. The man ran it through the scanner on his computer without so much as glancing at it, then stamped one of the pages. He did the same for Paul and Tamara. He took Alex's last, gazed at the photograph and lowered it behind the lid of his case. For a moment it was out of sight as he scanned it, but then he was holding it up again with a polite puzzlement. "I'm sorry, sir," he said to Drevin. "We have a problem here." "What problem?" Drevin was annoyed. "The passport is out of date. It expired 2 days ago." "That's not possible." Drevin reached for the passport. He looked at the expiry date, then at Alex. "The man is correct," he said. "No." Alex was shocked. It was true he hadn't looked closely at his passport for a long time, but he was certain he'd had it for years. There's an absurd photograph of him aged 10. He remembered going with Jack to have it taken. "It can't be," protested. Darren handed him the passport. I studied it. It was the same photo. The terrible haircut embarrassed him as it always did. There was his signature, and Iron Rider's name, and an address as Netof's kin. But the immigration man was correct. His passport had expired the day before he left London. "But how can it have happened?" I asked. He couldn't believe he'd been so stupid. Why didn't they notice at Heathrow? Guess they didn't look closely enough, the American said. "What does this mean?" Drone asked. His voice was cold. "Well, sir, I'm very sorry, but we can't allow your guest to enter the United States. In normal circumstances, he'd be sent home. But I guess we can work something else. How long do you plan to be here?" "Less than 24 hours, Drone replied. "We leave tomorrow. In that case, we can hold up Mr. Ryder here at the airport. It'll be like he's in transit. You can pick him up again when you leave. But Charles only wishes to stay here one night. Surely he can't be such a threat to American security that you won't allow him to stay with me. Very sorry, Mr. Drevin. It's like I say, really, he should be on his way back to the UK. I'm stretching things as it is, but I can't allow him in." "Don't understand." I only got it 4 years ago. I'm sure of it." He was feeling wretched. Both Drevin and his son were staring at him as if this was all his fault, which he supposed, in a way, it was. "It seems we have no choice in the matter, Alex," Drevin said. He turned to the immigration officer. "Where will you hold him?" "We have rooms at the airport, sir. He'll have a TV and a shower. I can assure you he'll be fine." "And then it seems we'll have to pick you up tomorrow, Alex." And Drevin got up and left the aircraft. Paul and Tamara followed. The assistant had said nothing throughout the discussion. Alex looked out of the window as they got into the limousine. A moment later, they drove away and he found himself alone with the two Americans. "Do you have any hand luggage?" the immigration man asked. "No." "Okay, my name's Shulsky. By the way, Ed Shulsky. You'd better come with me." I followed the American down onto the tarmac, the customs official close behind them. There was another car waiting for them, and Alex climbed into the back. Shulsky took the front seat. The other man stayed behind. "Just relax, this won't take long," Shulsky said. The doors had locked themselves automatically. Feeling far from relaxed, I sat back and watched where they were going. They drove out of the airport, passing through a double barrier and a gate that already struck him as odd. Hadn't Shulsky said he was going to have to spend the night at JFK? But it seems they were headed for Manhattan. The driver joined the traffic on the freeway that led to Brooklyn Bridge. Suddenly, Alex found himself looking across the water to the most famous skyline in the world. Even now, even in these circumstances, the view couldn't fail to thrill him. The magnificent arrogance of the skyscrapers packed together on the cramped, chaotic island of momentum to power and success, and the American way of life. Alex leaned forward. "Where are we going?" he demanded. "We'll be there soon," Shulsky answered. I thought you said we were staying at the airport." "Relax, Alex. We'll look after you." I just knew something was going on. There had been nothing wrong with his passport. He was sure of it, but there wasn't anything he could do. He was locked in a car on the other side the world, and you might just as well sit back and, as the Americans would say, be taken for the ride. He looked out of the window as they crossed the bridge and turned north, heading past terrible empty space where the World Trade Center had once stood. He had visited New York a couple of times and had happy memories of the city. Now he was being driven through Soho in South Manhattan. The car slowed down, and I noticed an art gallery with the windows full of cartoons. Its name was printed in gold letters on the glass. They turned into a parking garage. Alexander shook his head. Now he knew exactly where he was. In Miami. They called themselves Centurion International Advertising. The gallery here in New York was called Creative Ideas Animation. 2 different names, but the same 3 letters. CIA. The car drove up to the first floor of the garage. And stopped. Shelsky got out and opened the door for Alex. This way, he announced. Alex followed him to a bare door that could have led into a storage cupboard, or perhaps an electric generator room. A keypad was built into the wall, and Shelsky entered a 7-digit code. There was a buzz, and the door opened. Alex walked through into an empty corridor with a CCTV camera pointing down at him from above, and another locked door at the end. It swung open as he approached. There was a comfortable reception area on the other side, and beyond that, that open plan offices filled with phones and computers. 2 telephonists sat behind the main desk. Men and women in suits walked along the carpeted corridors. A black man with white hair and a moustache was waiting to greet him. Alex recognized him at once. His name was Joe Byrne. He was the deputy director for the operations in the Covert Action section of the Central Intelligence Agency of America. Nice to see you again, Alex, he said. I'm not so sure, he replied. He remembered how his passport had briefly disappeared into Shelsky's attached case. You swapped my passport. The one you showed Driven was a fake. Joe Byrne nodded. Come this way, let me show you to my office. I think it's time you and I had a little chat. Right, everybody. The end of me reading US Rider, so goodbye everyone, and thank you for listening to this.